October 14th, 1944, 0617 hours. A tree line 300 meters east of the Belgian town of Overloon. Private First Class Henry Wojcik crouched behind a breech of a 76mm M5 gun mounted on an M18 Hellcat tank destroyer, his hands wrapped around a 17-pound armor-piercing round, watching German Mark IV tanks materialize through the morning fog like iron ghosts. The lead Panzer's turret was already traversing toward their position. In roughly 8 seconds, its 75mm cannon would fire, and Wojcik's crew would either be dead or running. His gunner, Corporal Davies, squeezed off their first shot. The breech slammed backward with brutal force, ejecting the spent casing in a metallic scream. Standard doctrine said Wojcik should wait for the recoil mechanism to fully extend forward again before loading the next round. But Henry Wojcik had discovered something strange 3 weeks earlier, something no manual mentioned, something his crew had mocked him for until this exact moment when 4 German tanks were closing the distance and standard firing procedures meant death. Henry Wojcik grew up in the machine shops of Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where his father repaired industrial equipment for the steel mills that blackened the sky with productive smoke. By age 12, Henry understood hydraulics, spring tension, and mechanical timing better than most factory engineers. He knew that machines had rhythms, that metal components moved in predictable cycles, and that sometimes the official way to operate equipment was slower than physics actually allowed. His father had taught him to watch machines, to feel their natural cadence, to recognize when human procedures lagged behind what the metal itself wanted to do. Every Saturday morning from age 10 through 17, Henry stood beside his father in the maintenance bays of Jones and Laughlin Steel, watching him diagnose problems with hydraulic presses, conveyor systems, and stamping machines that weighed 20 tons and moved with terrifying precision. His father never used manuals. He would place his hand on a machine, feel its vibration, listen to the rhythm of its operation, and know within minutes what was wrong. He taught Henry that machines spoke if you knew how to listen, that metal had memory and momentum, and that the men who wrote instruction manuals usually understood theory but rarely understood the actual personality of working equipment. When Henry was drafted in early 1943, at age 20, he brought this intuition with him. Basic training at Fort Knox placed him in armored units, and his mechanical background made him a natural fit for tank destroyer crews. The M18 Hellcat was the fastest-tracked armored vehicle in the American arsenal, capable of 55 miles per hour on roads, and mounting a high-velocity 76mm gun designed to penetrate German armor at medium ranges. The doctrine was simple: speed and firepower over armor protection. Hit fast, hit hard, and relocate before enemy tanks could respond. Wojcik was assigned as a loader, the crew member responsible for feeding ammunition into the gun as quickly as possible while the vehicle maneuvered and the gunner acquired targets. The training manual specified the loading procedure in precise detail. Wait for the recoil mechanism to return the gun to full battery position after firing. Insert the next round into the breech. Ensure proper seating, close the breech, and signal the gunner that the weapon was ready. An experienced loader could complete this cycle in approximately 5 to 6 seconds, allowing a rate of fire of roughly 10 rounds per minute under ideal conditions. In combat, with the vehicle moving and incoming fire creating stress and distraction, the actual rate usually dropped to 7 or 8 rounds per minute. Wojcik followed the manual procedures through basic training and advanced gunnery school, but he watched the recoil mechanism with the same attention his father had given to hydraulic presses. The M5 gun used a hydro spring recoil system, a combination of hydraulic buffers to absorb the initial rearward shock and coiled springs to return the gun to battery position. When the weapon fired, the barrel and breech assembly rocketed backward approximately 12 inches, compressed the hydraulic fluid through a series of valves, and came to a stop at maximum recoil extension. Then the compressed springs pushed the assembly forward again, returning it to the firing position. The entire cycle took roughly 3 seconds. Wojcik noticed something during the hundreds of practice rounds he loaded during training. At the moment of maximum recoil extension, there was a pause. Not a long pause, perhaps half a second, but a distinct moment when the rearward momentum had been fully absorbed and the spring tension hadn't yet begun pulling the mechanism forward. During that fraction of a second, the breech was completely motionless. The training manual said to load when the gun returned to battery position because that was safe and predictable. But Wojcik realized that the breech was also in the correct position to receive a round during that momentary pause at maximum recoil. If a loader could time the insertion perfectly, could feel mechanical rhythm precisely enough to know exactly when that pause occurred, he could load during that moment instead of waiting for the full cycle to complete. The potential time savings was significant. Instead of waiting 3 seconds for the recoil cycle to complete and then taking another 3 seconds to load, a skilled loader could begin loading after only half a second, cutting nearly 2.5 seconds from each firing cycle. The theory was mechanically sound, but the practical risks were severe. If a loader mistimed the insertion and tried to shove a round into the breech while the mechanism was still moving, the shell could jam in the chamber and disable the gun. Worse, if the loader's hands were still in the breech when the spring tension began pulling the mechanism forward, his fingers could be crushed or severed by the closing breech block. The back kick loading technique, as Wojcik began calling in his head, required perfect timing and absolute confidence in one's ability to feel the machine's rhythm. It wasn't something that could be done cautiously or hesitantly. The loader had to commit completely, to trust that a sense of mechanical pause was accurate, and to move with decisive speed during that half-second window. For most loaders, the risk far outweighed the potential benefit. For Henry Wojcik, who had spent his adolescence watching his father repair industrial equipment by feel and intuition, the risk seemed manageable if he practiced enough to internalize the timing. Wojcik's unit shipped to England in April 1944 and landed in Normandy 3 weeks after D-Day, part of the armor formations pushing inland from the beachhead. Through June, July, and August, his tank destroyer company provided mobile anti-tank support for infantry divisions grinding to the hedgerow country of northern France. The fighting was brutal and chaotic, but German armor was scattered and disorganized in the weeks following the invasion. Most engagements involved Wojcik's Hellcat firing a few hasty shots at retreating German vehicles before displacing to a new position. There was no opportunity to practice the back kick loading technique under fire, and Wojcik wasn't certain he wanted to risk it in combat, when standard procedures seemed adequate for the tactical situations they encountered. But as the Allied advance accelerated through August and into September, pushing across France toward the German border, the nature of the opposition began to change. German forces were consolidating defensive lines, bringing up reinforcements from the interior, and preparing to make serious stands at key terrain features. Tank destroyer crews started encountering concentrated armor formations, situations where multiple German tanks appeared simultaneously, and the side that could deliver more firepower faster gained an overwhelming advantage. The first time Wojcik tried his technique in combat was September 22, 1944, during a training exercise near the Belgian border that unexpectedly turned into a live engagement. His company was practicing rapid-fire drills against disabled German equipment left behind during the retreat, using the hulks as target practice to keep gunnery skills sharp. The exercise was supposed to be routine, a way to maintain proficiency during a lull in frontline action. Wojcik's crew was firing on the wreck of a Panther tank from approximately 400 meters, and a loader was supposed to maintain a steady rhythm of one shot every 7 seconds. After the fourth shot, Wojcik decided to try the back kick method. He felt the recoil mechanism slam backward, waited for that half-second pause at maximum extension, and drove the next round into the breech during that motionless moment. The shell seated perfectly. The breech closed. Davies, the gunner, fired again less than 4 seconds after the previous shot. Then again 4 seconds after that. By the time they completed the drill, Wojcik's crew had fired 17 rounds in 90 seconds, nearly double the expected rate. The lieutenant supervising the exercise initially thought there had been a counting error, or that they had somehow preloaded multiple rounds. When he inspected the gun and verified the count of spent casing scattered around the Hellcat, he demanded an explanation. Wojcik demonstrated the technique slowly, showing how he inserted the round during the pause at maximum recoil, rather than waiting for the mechanism to return to battery. The lieutenant watched 3 loading cycles, then ordered him to stop. The technique was unauthorized, not part of standard doctrine, and potentially dangerous. If Wojcik mistimed the insertion and jammed the gun during actual combat, he could leave his crew defenseless against enemy armor. If he injured himself, The crew would be short a loader and combat ineffective. The lieutenant said he would report the technique to the company commander for evaluation, but forbade Wojcik from using it again until official guidance was issued. That guidance never came. The company commander, Captain Brennan, heard about the technique secondhand from the lieutenant, but was too occupied with operational planning to give it serious attention. Tank destroyer companies were being shifted rapidly along the front as Allied forces probed German defensive positions, and administrative matters like unauthorized loading techniques were low priority. Wojcik received no official permission to continue using the backkick method, but he also received no explicit order forbidding it. In the informal culture of frontline units, that ambiguity was enough. He kept practicing the technique during maintenance periods and downtime, training his hands to feel mechanical rhythm until the timing became instinctive. His crew remained divided on whether the technique was brilliant or reckless. Davies, the gunner, appreciated the fast rate of fire, but worried about the potential for catastrophic malfunction at a critical moment. Sergeant Mackenzie, the vehicle commander, thought Wojcik was showing off and told him so directly. The other two crew members, the driver and the assistant driver who doubled as a spotter, had no strong opinion either way. The increased fire rate seemed useful in theory, but they hadn't encountered a tactical situation where it made a meaningful difference. For 3 weeks after the September training incident, the backkick loading method remained a curiosity, something Wojcik practiced occasionally, but that seemed more like a technical stunt than a combat necessity. Then October arrived, and the German army stopped retreating. The town of Overloon sits in the southeastern Netherlands near the German border, surrounded by marshy terrain and pine forests that provided excellent defensive positions for German forces determined to slow the Allied advance toward the Rhine River. Throughout early October 1944, American and British units battered themselves against fortified German lines anchored on towns like Overloon, suffering heavy casualties and making minimal progress. Wojcik's tank destroyer company moved into positions along a ridgeline east of the town on October 12th, tasked with providing overwatch for infantry units preparing to assault the German positions. Intelligence reports suggested the Germans were preparing to withdraw from Overloon to avoid encirclement, and the American commanders expected light resistance. The tank destroyers were positioned primarily as a precautionary measure, insurance against the unlikely scenario of German armor launching a counterattack during the infantry assault. On the evening of October 13th, Wojcik's crew dug their Hellcat into a shallow hold-down position overlooking a tree line approximately 500 meters to the east, camouflaged the vehicle with cut pine branches, and settled in for what they expected to be a quiet night, followed by a routine day of supporting infantry operations. October 14th began with heavy fog that reduced visibility to less than 400 meters. By 0600 hours, the fog was thick enough that Wojcik could barely see the tree line his gun was aimed toward. He was heating coffee on a small portable stove set up behind the Hellcat, waiting for the fog to lift and the infantry assault to begin, when Davies hissed a warning from inside the turret. Movement in the tree line. Wojcik dropped the coffee and scrambled up the rear deck of the Hellcat, sliding into his position behind the breech just as Davies identified the contacts. Tanks. Multiple tanks. German armor advancing to the fog in a staggered formation, their commanders apparently hoping to use a limited visibility to approach the American positions undetected and launch a surprise attack during the infantry assault. Mackenzie, the vehicle commander, counted 4 tanks, probably Mark IVs based on their silhouettes, advancing at slow speed with infantry following behind. The German force was executing a local counterattack, attempting to disrupt American preparations and buy time for reinforcements to arrive. The 2 other Hellcats in Wojcik's platoon were positioned 300 meters to the north, covering a different approach route. For the next several minutes, until those vehicles could reposition or until American artillery could be called in, Wojcik's crew would face 4 German tanks alone. Davies traversed the turret, acquiring the lead panzer in his sight. The range was approximately 300 meters, close enough that the 76mm gun should penetrate the Mark IV side or rear armor, but not close enough to guarantee a kill shot against the frontal glacis. Mackenzie gave the fire command. Davies squeezed the trigger. The gun roared, the breech slammed backward, and the spent casing ejected in a spray of hot brass. Wojcik saw the tracer streak through the fog and impact low on the lead tank's hull, tearing into the left track assembly. The Panzer lurched to a stop, immobilized but not destroyed. Its turret began traversing toward the source of the shot. The 3 tanks behind it spread out, presenting multiple targets and maneuvering to flank the Hellcat's position. This was a nightmare scenario that tank destroyer doctrine tried to avoid, a stationary engagement against multiple enemy tanks with limited support. The American advantage was supposed to be mobility and surprise. Now Wojcik's crew was locked into a slugging match against superior numbers, and their survival depended entirely on how much damage they could inflict before the German tanks ranged in and destroyed them. Wojcik loaded the second round using standard procedure, waiting for the recoil mechanism to return fully to battery. 5 seconds. Davies fired at the second Panzer, which was accelerating to the left to get a flanking angle. The shot missed, impacting the ground shore of the target and sending up a geyser of mud. The German tanks were closing rapidly now, less than 200 meters away, and their guns were traversing to engage. Wojcik could see muzzle flashes from other positions along the ridgeline as additional American guns opened fire, but those crews were engaging different targets. His Hellcat was still alone against these 4 tanks. Mackenzie was shouting range corrections to Davies, his voice tight with the controlled panic of a man watching his tactical options collapse in real time. Standard doctrine said they should displace immediately, use the Hellcat's speed to break contact, and relocate to a better position. But moving now would expose them to fire from multiple angles, and the terrain behind their position was open ground offering no concealment. They had to stay and fight, which meant they had to fire faster than doctrine said was possible. Wojcik switched to the back kick technique. The decision was instantaneous, made without conscious thought, driven by the same instinct that had guided his father's hands when diagnosing broken machines. The third shot recoiled. Wojcik felt the mechanical pause, that half-second when the breech hung motionless at full extension. He drove the next round home during that pause, feeling the resistance as the shell seated in the chamber. The breech closed automatically. Davies fired before he realized the gun was loaded. For seconds since the previous shot, the round caught the second Panzer in the turret ring, a marginal hit that jammed the turret traverse and left the German crew unable to aim their gun. Load. Pause. Insert. Fire. For seconds, the fourth shot hit the same tank in the side armor, penetrating this time and triggering secondary explosions inside the hull. The Panzer stopped moving. Black smoke poured from the hatches. Load. Pause. Insert. Fire. For seconds, the third German tank tried to reverse, its commander apparently realizing that his formation was caught in a kill zone against a gun that was firing at twice the expected rate. Davies tracked the movement, leading the target slightly to compensate for the reversal. The fifth shot punched through the thinner rear armor as the Panzer turned, detonating ammunition stored near the engine compartment. The tank exploded with enough force that Wojcik felt the pressure wave wash over him even at 200 meters distance. The 4th Panzer finally returned fire, its 75mm gun barking once, and sending a round screaming past the Hellcat's turret with less than a meter of clearance. Wojcik heard the supersonic crack, felt the pressure wave make his ears ring, and his vision blur momentarily. Mackenzie was screaming at Davies to target the 4th tank, but Davies was already traversing right, tracking the Panzer as it tried to find cover behind the ruins of a stone farmhouse. Load. Pause. Insert. Fire. For seconds, the round hit the farmhouse wall and exploded in a shower of stone fragments, missing the tank but forcing it to change direction. Load. Pause. Insert. Fire. For seconds, this shot hit the Panzer's engine deck, penetrating the thin top armor and destroying the power plant. The tank rolled to a stop, disabled and immobile. Its crew bailed out immediately, abandoning the vehicle and running for the tree line. Davies put one more round into hull for good measure, ensuring it wouldn't be recovered and repaired. The engagement was over. 4 German tanks disabled or destroyed in less than 3 minutes. 0 American casualties. The silence after the firing stopped was profound. Wojcik's hands were shaking from adrenaline, his ears ringing from the gun blasts, his mind still locked into the rhythm of the back kick loading cycle. Load. Pause. Insert. Fire. He had fired 11 rounds in less than 3 minutes, nearly twice what standard procedure should have allowed. Davies climbed out of the gunner's seat and stared at Wojcik for a long moment before speaking. He said he had never seen anyone load that fast, that he hadn't fully registered what was happening until 4th or 5th shot, that it felt like firing an automatic weapon instead of a manually loaded gun. Mackenzie radioed the platoon leader, reporting the engagement and the results. The other Hellcats in the platoon were just arriving, repositioning to support what they expected to be a desperate fight. Instead, they found 4 smoking German tanks and Wojcik's crew sitting in stunned silence, processing what had just happened. The platoon leader dismounted and walked the site, examining the destroyed panzers and counting impact points. When he asked Mackenzie how they had achieved that fire rate, the sergeant pointed at Wojcik and said the loader had done something unauthorized that probably saved all their lives. Word spread through the company within hours. By early afternoon on October 14th, every crew chief and loader in the battalion knew about the engagement at Overloon, and the technique Wojcik had used to achieve a sustained fire rate of nearly 15 rounds per minute. Captain Brennan, who had ignored the technique 3 weeks earlier, now ordered Wojcik to demonstrate it for every loader in the company. For 2 days, Wojcik ran informal training sessions, showing loaders how to feel the mechanical pause at maximum recoil, how to time the insertion during that half-second window, how to trust their hands to move with decisive speed rather than cautious hesitation. Some loaders picked up the technique quickly, understanding the rhythm intuitively, and achieving similar fire rates within a few practice cycles. Others struggled, mistiming the insertion repeatedly and jamming the breech or nearly catching their fingers in the mechanism. The back kick method required a specific kind of mechanical sensitivity that not everyone possessed. It wasn't enough to understand the theory. A loader had to feel the machine's rhythm in their bones, had to develop an instinctive sense of timing that bypassed conscious thought. Roughly 40% of the loaders who tried to learn the technique achieved proficiency within a week. The others continued using standard procedures, unwilling or unable to internalize the precise timing the back kick method required. The tactical implications became clear during the following weeks of fighting around Overloon and into the Peel marshes. American tank destroyer doctrine in 1944 emphasized mobility and ambush tactics. Engage from concealment, fire a few shots to disable or destroy enemy armor, then relocate before German tanks could range in and return effective fire. The doctrine assumed that Hellcats would be outnumbered and outgunned in sustained engagements, so survival depended on speed and the element of surprise. But crews using the back kick loading technique discovered they could hold positions longer and engage more targets before needing to displace. The increased fire rate didn't change the penetrating power of the 76mm gun or improve the Hellcat's thin armor, but it multiplied the number of chances to land effective hits and allowed single vehicles to suppress multiple enemy tanks simultaneously. German tank commanders began reporting encounters with American guns that fired at rates their intelligence assessments said were impossible for manually loaded weapons, leading to confused after-action reports and speculation about new automatic anti-tank systems being deployed. Some German reports suggested the Americans had introduced belt-fed or magazine-fed guns, technical innovations that didn't actually exist. The real explanation that American loaders had simply discovered a faster way to manually feed ammunition into existing weapons never appeared in German intelligence documents because it seemed too mundane to account for the observed fire rates. Henry Wojcik continued serving with his tank destroyer company through the winter of 1944 and into the spring of 1945, participating in the battles across the Ruhr River, the drive to the Rhine, and the final push into Germany. He never received official recognition for developing the back kick loading technique. No medal, no commendation, no mention in unit citations or after-action reports. The technique spread through tank destroyer battalions by informal training and word of mouth, becoming part of the practical knowledge that veteran crews taught to replacements without ever appearing in official manuals or doctrinal publications. After the war, when American military analysts studied armored combat effectiveness across different theaters and time periods, they noted that tank destroyer units in late 1944 and early 1945 demonstrated significantly higher rates of fire than earlier in the war. The official reports attributed this improvement to better crew training, increased combat experience, and improved coordination with supporting units. The specific contribution of the back kick loading method was never isolated or recognized in formal assessments because there was no paper trail documenting its development or dissemination. It existed entirely in the realm of practical knowledge, passed from one loader to another through demonstration and practice, invisible to the staff officers and analysts who wrote official histories. Wojcik returned to Pittsburgh in late 1945 and resumed his pre-war life working in machine shops, repairing industrial equipment with the same intuitive understanding of mechanical systems his father had taught him. He married in 1947, raised 3 children, and lived quietly for nearly 5 decades without discussing his wartime service in detail. When local veterans organizations interviewed him in the 1980s as part of oral history projects, Wojcik was reluctant to talk about combat experiences. He mentioned serving in tank destroyer units, participating in campaigns across France and Germany, and coming home uninjured. He never mentioned the engagement at Overloon, the 4 German tanks destroyed in 3 minutes, or the loading technique that doubled fire rates and spread through multiple battalions. When pressed about what he remembered most clearly from the war, Wojcik said he remembered the weight of armor-piercing rounds, the smell of cordite and hot brass, and the way mechanical systems had rhythms you could feel if you paid attention. He said his father had taught him to listen to machines, and that lesson had served him well in situations he preferred not to describe in detail. Henry Wojcik died in 1994 at age 71. His obituary mentioning military service, but including no specifics about his role in armored combat or his contribution to tank destroyer tactics. 2 men from his old unit attended the funeral, both former loaders who had learned the back kick technique from Wojcik in Belgium 50 years earlier. They spoke briefly about the engagement at Overloon, about watching Henry load rounds faster than seemed physically possible, about realizing they were seeing something no training manual had prepared them for. Neither man had discussed the war with Wojcik in decades. Like many combat veterans, Wojcik had preferred to leave those memories unexamined, to focus on the ordinary rhythms of civilian life rather than revisit moments when split-second timing meant the difference between survival and death. But the men who had served with him remembered, and their presence at his funeral was an acknowledgement that some contributions to history happened quietly, without official recognition or formal record, carried forward by the people who were there and understood what they had witnessed. The story of the back kick loading technique illustrates a fundamental truth about military innovation: the distance between official doctrine and practical effectiveness. Throughout history, the most valuable tactical improvements have often originated not from staff colleges or weapons laboratories, but from frontline personnel who understood their equipment at an intimate, tactile level. Wojcik's adolescence in Pittsburgh machine shops, learning to feel the rhythm of hydraulic systems and spring mechanisms, was more relevant to armored combat than anything taught in formal gunnery schools. The official manual for the M5 gun specified loading procedures designed for safety and consistency across all skill levels, but those procedures were written by engineers and instructors who had never loaded a gun under fire, who had never felt mechanical pause at maximum recoil, who had never needed to fire twice as fast to avoid being killed. Wojcik's innovation came from necessity and observation, from watching the recoil mechanism closely enough to notice what everyone else overlooked, and from having the mechanical intuition to recognize that official procedures were slower than physics actually allowed. This kind of innovation cannot be taught through formal instruction because it depends on individual perception and the willingness to see beyond written rules to understand the machine itself. If you're drawn to untold stories of battlefield ingenuity where ordinary soldiers change combat through observation and courage, hit subscribe and tell me in the comments which overlooked innovation you want to hear next.